This is Cody McLean from the Mindhack podcast, a place where we explore the routines, mindset, and experiences of successful people in their field, whatever that field may be. Today, we're looking at the world of memory, something we all seemingly neglect and fall back into this fixed mindset of believing we just have bad memories. I've nearly always thought of myself as having the worst memory because I'd never be able to remember conversations, people's names, or other seemingly insequential things from our past. And I know what you're thinking. This Nelson fella, he's a Rain Man, right? Well, I can assure you, he is not. He's just an average Joe who's taken up a skill of memorization. It's a technique that dates back thousands of years, and in this conversation, you too can learn how to improve your memory with simple techniques that you can practice anywhere, whether you're standing in line at the grocery store or even when you're stuck in rush hour traffic. But with me here today is somebody special. His name is Nelson Dellis, and he is a 4-time world memory championship and has the US memory records for memorizing the most names and words in 15 minutes. That's 217 names and 256 words, as well as memorizing 907 digits in 30 minutes and memorizing the most decks of playing cards in 30 minutes at 9.02 decks. Nelson is also the published author of the book Remember It, a book about his research into memory theory and improvement. Now, I read his book prior to this interview, and I have to say it is one of the best, most engaging books I've read in recent times. In this interview, Nelson not only comes across as a great person, but also a fantastic writer. He even had Dr. Sanjay Gupta write the intro for his book, and he's personally made many public appearances on places like The Today Show, Katie Couric Show, CNN, ABC, and much more. Lastly, he is the co-founder of The Memory League, a free online community and championship. And if that's not enough, he's also an avid climber and has made 3 attempts to reach the summit of Mount Everest. He does so in an attempt to raise money and awareness for Alzheimer's through his foundation called Climb for Memory. With his short bio aside, this is an interesting conversation where we discuss how he not only discovered the world of memory, but as well as some of the specific techniques you can pick up and start using pretty much instantly. You'll even hear how he used his memory to cover the tab of a $600 restaurant bill. So if you've ever thought you had a bad memory, this episode is going to flip your world upside down because anybody, truly anybody, can drastically improve their ability to remember things with the right attitude and technique. So without further ado, here is Nelson Dellis. Thank you, Nelson. I'd like to introduce you to the Mindhack podcast. I'm Cody. Can you tell myself and the audience perhaps a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name's Nelson. I actually was born with an average memory, believe it or not. And it's something that I've, in the past 10 years, worked on and really made my life's work and turned it into a business and had a lot of success in competitions and setting records and things like that. And now I can proudly say that I'm, a 4-time US memory champion and grandmaster of memory and a memory coach.
Now, I was reading your book prior to us having this conversation, and I just have to say it was very eye-opening in terms of all the techniques. And really, it just comes down to having a visual image, right, of visualizing what we're looking at in order to remember it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's the problem with information these days is that it's in a form that isn't very interesting to most of us. And especially in a day and age when it's very hard to capture our attentions because so much is coming at us, that makes things even more so unmemorable. So if you can turn it into one of these pictures that actually has a lot of emotion and interest to you, then you can make it a lot more memorable that way.
Right. And you documented techniques such as the memory palace, or you call it the memory journey, I believe.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, can you tell me about one technique that would be very simple for us to implement about any memory technique?
Yeah. So memory palace is kind of the most powerful, I think, in my mind, but it does take a little bit of a mouthful to explain how to work it. So a lot simpler. We can just talk about kind of the basic idea is that whenever you want to memorize something, the best way to do it is to think of the thing you're memorizing in terms of picture that you can put in your mind's eye.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as we do that, you're taking advantage of something that our brains are naturally good at, which is thinking in pictures. They were designed for that. They were not designed for abstract concepts or numbers, symbols, things like that. So the first thing you want to do is whenever you're encountered with something that you want to memorize is try to see it as something that's silly or bizarre or over the top that you can picture in your mind.
Right. Now, I've used this technique to remember to lock my door, because there's been times, especially where I travel, and I'll have this anxiety of like, oh, did I lock my door? And one thing I've done is I will lock it, but then consciously say pink rabbit, elephant, Floyd, Mayhem circus, and I'll just say something completely bizarre and chaotic that it will stick in my memory that I will know I had locked the door.
That's great. Yeah. And I actually have a little section on that in my book where basically for people who want to remember something like whether they locked their door or not, or unplugged, their hairdryer, or took their medicine for the day, when you do the thing that you're sure that you're going to forget, what you do is you try to maybe verbalize something totally out of the norm or do some kind of action that is unique and memorable to that situation. And the weirder you can make it, obviously the more memorable it is, because later on when you're, traveling on your plane and you're stressing about whether you locked your door or not, you're suddenly going to remember that thing you did or said at the moment you locked the door. And you'll be like, oh yeah, of course I'd lock my door because of the pink elephant, whatever thing that I said.
Yeah, and you had some great examples showing that in the book, such as imagining that there's a tractor coming at you and George W. Bush is our former president, and he's moonwalking a la Jackson style, smoking a cigarette, and he puts the cigarette on the back of a turtle that is playing an acoustic guitar with a mushroom. Yeah. And that comes back to memorizing a 24-digit number. And it is eye-opening, I think, to the first time that you read something like this, how crazy it is. But I mean, the idea of picturing your grandmother naked is probably very extreme for some people, but to be able to do these types of things allows you to remember all these variations of numbers and various techniques.
Yeah. And that example you told me is something that's early on in my book, where I'm trying to get people to see how easy it is to picture something as silly as what you said. And what the power it holds is that, for me, in that example, it actually represents that 24-digit number. And I outline later in the book how to know that those numbers represent those pictures, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is so that people realize that it's easy for us to think of pictures. It's difficult for us to think of complicated symbols like numbers. So any chance you get, you want to try to turn it into those memorable pictures, and it'll stick better.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, you got to have some uncomfortable pictures of seeing your grandmother naked, or you have some people in your memory palace or in your mind that you don't necessarily want to see in there because you have bad feelings towards them or don't really care for them. But that's what makes things memorable. Sometimes I get pictures I don't really want to see, but the fact that I don't want to see them makes them emotionally kind of disgusting or uncomfortable, and then they stick even better. So I allow them.
Mm. And so would you be able to sum up what the difference is between, say, remembering something and then forgetting something? Like what makes us remember something? Yeah.
I feel like maybe let's start with the forgetting, because I feel like forgetting is when you don't have a memorable enough connection to something. And there's different ways, I guess, you could talk about forgetting, because forgetting implies that you have it in your brain. or had it at one point, right?
Mhm.
Obviously, you can't forget something if you didn't memorize it in the first place. And sometimes if you're not primed to take in some information, or you're not paying attention rather, that doesn't count as, something that you remembered. Even though you say like, oh, I'm listening, but you're actually not because you're thinking about something else, then you're never
Mhm.
going to remember that because it never got registered. So that's not really forgetting. Forgetting, I think, is if you know you learned it, you tried to learn it, it's in your head somewhere, you just couldn't kind of connect the neurons to fetch that piece of information.
Mm.
So when I say people forget things, or they think they have a bad memory because they're always forgetting, I say no. It's only because of two things. One, that because you weren't paying attention and you actually didn't really memorize it at all. Or secondly, is you didn't come up with a good enough picture that tied enough of your senses and emotional thoughts and feelings to make it memorable.
Right. Even when I'm in this conversation with you, it's difficult because on one hand, I want to think about what I'm going to say next, but then I also want to listen to what you're saying so that I can either determine whether I'm going to bring up my next question or respond to your current statement.
Mm-hmm.
And doing so can be very difficult. But then also, even when I meet somebody and they tell me their name, I just, even though I'm trying to bring this practice into my forefront, it's difficult in a sense. Like 5 seconds after they tell me their name, I ask myself, what's their name? And I just completely forgot. I'm curious, how do you create that mental sticky note to remember these things?
Yeah, that's a tough thing to deal with. It's one thing to say, I'm going to sit down and practice my memory and memorize names. And it's another to be out live with people, with noises around you, and other people interacting with you have things to do or have a different way of presenting their name or information to you. So it's tough to prepare. In a way, you have to be able to improvise. And of course, this is where practice comes in. So techniques themselves will take you so far, but if you're not actively trying to get better at them every day, then you're not going to get much better in real time. And so dealing with, conversations that people actually have while you're trying to memorize their name, or information that's coming at you while distractions are happening all around you, by practicing these techniques and doing them a lot, you actually get better kind of naturally at being able to make those mental sticky notes on the fly. It's hard to describe, but it's just something that comes with time, because what you're really doing when you're training your memory is priming it to know how to lay out information in a memorable way every time, right? With everything. And that just becomes a natural part of your thought process when you're doing anything cognitively.
Mm. Now, there's one technique that you talked about called the PEC system.
Yes.
And it's something that I was aware of prior to reading your book. And I've tried to memorize these items, these associations, where just between 0 and 10, using something like tiny cards, which is a SRS, a space repetition, kind of like an online flashcard system that is created by Duolingo. But then I believe also in your book, you mentioned something like Anki, which is a way of trying to memorize something, but it's somewhat rote memorization. And even trying to go back and memorize the associations I have between 0 and 10, I can't always recall them. Like I know that 7 is heaven and 8 is gate. I forgot what 9 is. And so what is your technique? Because you have all these various memorization methods. You have the major system and others that I just completely forgot about. But how do you stay on top and remember these various systems? Is it just simply a matter of continuous practice until they're in your long-term memory?
That's a part of it, because, the last thing I want, especially in competition, is that I'm trying to remember my actual strategy, right? That should be so kind of ingrained in second nature that I don't have to think of it at all and never forget it, because I'm actually memorizing other stuff with it. So a good example of this is all the memory palaces that I have. I have hundreds, and they span hundreds of locations. And, I have some that I practice with regularly, and there's no question I know them like the back of my hand. But some of them, I haven't used maybe as frequently. And sometimes I do forget bits and pieces of it and have to go back and review. And it's frustrating because like I said, I don't want to waste time trying to remember those things. But the way you get those things into your head is just through frequent use. But then also, I mean, some things like if you're talking about your PEC system for numbers, it is helpful to have a consistent one, so like 8 is always gate, 7 is heaven always. But, it's not a big deal if you actually have to maybe just improvise. That you kind of know the structure is that you're just trying to find a word that rhymes. So why not make it up as you go sometimes if you have a blank? So like 9, for me, the first thing that comes to mind would be wine or slime, something like that. I wouldn't be too worried if I forgot that, especially for just 10 digits. But yeah, if you want them there, it's a matter of frequent use practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you also talk about in your book about using this whenever you're in between things, something like remembering a license plate. And recently I was at a restaurant, and after reading your book, they had these 5 various options. It was like a bowl place. And so what I decided to do was use your technique of visualizing of the C-Link Go technique. Mm-hmm. And I thought of grass, which was referring to the spring mix, and then it being spring and growing a lemongrass. And so I chose the lemongrass. And then there were chickens plucking about in the grass. And then I remember chicken. And I was able to form this image that even 5 days later, I remember exactly what I ordered at this restaurant, which is typically nothing I would actually be able to remember, because I always thought of myself as somebody who has the worst memory, that I actually created a story for myself saying, you know what, I don't remember people's names and all these frivolous details because I spend my time memorizing the important things. But now I know in some ways that's just not true.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. But yeah, that's exactly what I kind of outline in my book to kind of keep it as simple as possible. Is it's all about seeing what you're trying to memorize, linking it to some kind of firmly placed thing in your mind already, and then go, which is to really add like that memorableness to it, making it funny, bizarre, out of the ordinary. And you can apply that to anything, whether it's you're trying to memorize a number or, moments in your life where you're ordering something at a restaurant or out with someone important to you. You can always do this process, see, link, go. And if you can constantly try to see things in your mind as pictures that are colorful and creative, and then kind of relate them somehow to things you already know, that's the link, and then add some secret sauce to it to make it a little over the top, then you're going to have a better time remembering a lot of your life.
Mm-hmm. And another common example you gave in the book is, say, getting directions from somebody that you want to turn left at this square, you want to go up these 2 blocks and then turn right. And in my mind, I have trouble imagining how I can create this mental image within this short time frame of somebody actually giving me these instructions in, say, 30 seconds. And I'm curious, what advice would you give to somebody who's trying to implement these visualization techniques, but the time frame you have is so limited?
Yeah, and I recognize that. I mean, even for me, it's under the stress of those kind of interactions on the street. There's cars honking, people running by. We're both rushing in our respective directions. It's not always feasible to be like, hold on, I'm gonna memorize this. Give me a second while you say these. No. But what you can do is, you're trying to remember information that someone's giving to you at a high rate. I don't think it's too out of the ordinary to ask them to repeat themselves a little bit. And again, it's to make the effort to try to memorize it using this little process. And the more you do it, I guarantee you, the easier it becomes. The problem, I guess, is that you're like, well, I don't want to forget this right now. I'm too busy. I don't want to get lost. So you'll just not try to memorize it. You'll write it down or, put it in your phone, but then you're just kind of feeding the cycle. So when are you ever going to try to do it? The best time to do it is when there's more high stakes, right? Mm-hmm. And the stakes would be that you get lost. So just kind of throwing yourself in the mix, trying your best. And if you have to, just ask for it again. Be like, listen, I'm doing my best here to remember what you said. Do you say left or right here? You just got to try to ask for it and maybe ask them to slow down a tiny bit,
Yeah. I imagine it's also a matter of creating a habit, because there's been many times where I'm aware of the technique and I just don't really want to, or I don't have the energy to try and picture it in a mental image.
Exactly.
You've had those experiences, I'm sure, where you have to like force yourself to actually think about it, because it takes a lot of mental energy to try and visualize these things, to create these associations.
It does. And memorizing something doesn't really sound like the sexiest thing to do. Most people would groan at the thought of having to memorize something. But, the more you do it, the more you practice, the more you realize that it's actually a lot of fun to memorize things using this bizarre imagery, the more you want to do it. And then the more you're encouraged to do it in more day-to-day situations. And I think that's where, you'll tend to opt for the real brain memorization in situations like that rather than use your phone.
Yeah. And I imagine, you don't talk about this in the book, but I really imagine that having this visualization and doing it on a regular basis actually would make you more creative, because you're using your brain to think about all these outlandish things that you would otherwise not care to think about. And in the practice of doing so, I imagine that there's some way that it also makes you more creative. Have you thought about that at all?
Definitely. And I've always been somewhat creative growing up, but not like this. For people listening who are saying to themselves, I'm not very creative, I'm not an artsy person or anything, but I don't necessarily buy that. I think that we can all be creative in our own ways, maybe not in the exact same visual ways, but there is a lot that people miss out on by not kind of tapping into their creative mind. And memory techniques definitely opens that way up. And I've seen that kind of help me in other things. It's helped me kind of think way outside the box for things unrelated to memory that I never would have been able to think of prior to mastering these techniques.
And now there are some cool benefits to having a great memory technique. And one that you talked about, I'd love for you to elaborate on, is a time that you were able to get your entire meal tab, which was about $650 covered by the restaurant.
Yeah, that was a great summer where I just kind of made a new group of friends, and they were learning about who I was and what I could do with my memory. And, we'd go out to big dinners together, and all our credit cards would be thrown into a pile to split the bill. And someone would always say to the manager, hey, this guy can memorize, blah, blah, blah. What if you memorize all the credit cards? Would you consider giving us the meal for free? And at one place, the guy said, yeah, sure, that's impossible. Of course, I did it. It wasn't that hard. And we ended up doing that a few times that summer at different restaurants. It was kind of our little parlor trick. It was pretty fun. We didn't always get the full bill for free, but we got, like a complimentary dessert or whatever. It was good times.
I'm wondering if you could try and briefly explain, I know it's a bit complicated, but briefly explain the technique that you use for memorizing those credit card numbers.
Yeah, so most credit cards are about 16 digits or so. So there were about 10, so that's 160 digits, right? And the guy gave me 5 minutes, which to most people, that's very difficult to do. My personal record is memorizing about 400 digits in 5 minutes. So This was relatively a lot of time to do what was asked of me. But what I did is for each card, I basically split the number up into my number system and then kind of attach that little story that I came up with to the image of the card. Some had like a blue MasterCard, another one was like a American Express green. So I'd kind of attach the story to that card because he did the cards out of order too. So I had to say, oh, that's the green American Express. Okay, this is the story that goes with it. And it's basically, I have a number system for every 3-digit combination. That's 1,000 different images that I have preset in my mind. But every time I see any of those combinations, I already have an image that I go to represent those numbers. And what it ends up being is just I weave a story together with all the images that come from those numbers. And just that alone makes them incredibly weird and memorable.
And you were able to get a lot of free bills out of that.
Yeah.
And so I would absolutely recommend to anybody listening to absolutely read his book. It's called Remember. It's available on Amazon and probably everywhere else. And I was also a bit, I'm going to use the word flabbergasted, that you were even able to get Dr. Sanjay Gupta to write your foreword.
Hey, me too. I was so happy when he said yes. I didn't think he would, but he was a super nice guy. I met him when we did a small segment for a CNN bit about memory. And I think the reason he did it is because I walked him through an example of how to use this visualization and memory palace technique, and he was floored by it as well. And I think he never forgot that. So he was happy to help.
Mm. And on the topic of memory palace, so I think Josh from the Walking with Einstein, he did a great job of explaining the memory palace that I still can think of to this day, where he used the term, if you meet somebody whose name is Baker, you're not going to remember that. But if they say that they're a baker, you imagine all the senses, the smells, the imagery, that they're wearing a baker's hat. And even in your book, you have this example of walking through a house and trying to memorize a checklist for a shopping list. And so I imagine going into the kitchen, I see Coca-Cola labels all over. I see somebody running around like naked with their Coca-Cola bottles, spraying it on the walls and stuff. And then I go into the living room where there's a fireplace, and I imagine a baker putting in bread and the smell of bread and all that. And so in some ways, a palace, a memory palace, is just you visualizing yourself walking through the various rooms in your house. Now, one thing that I think even Josh only briefly mentioned, at which I don't think you talked about in your book, was at how many memory palaces can you possibly have, as well as I think the issue that Josh encountered is trying to remove the existing associations so he could reuse the memory palace for other types of memory techniques. I'm curious, have you ever done that? Do you just keep going to new places and trying to memorize them? Have you ever tried to remove existing associations so you can use, say, your house for something else?
Yeah, I actually have a little section in the book about kind of managing your memory palaces, because that's one of the frequent questions I get is, okay, cool, you show me how to use a memory palace. How do I realistically use this for things in my daily life? Like, to-do lists change every day, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm going to memorize them every day, what's going to happen with the to-do list I memorized in my house yesterday? Is it going to clash? Am I going to remember that one instead of today's? Or what about stuff I want to keep forever, right?
Mm.
So the way I approach that is you kind of have to decide what you want to do with it. If it's something you'd like to keep forever, like let's say you want to learn, the periodic table, and that's just something you want to have in your brain for all time, right? For all access. Then what I would do is create a memory palace specifically for that piece of information and never put anything else there aside from the periodic table.
Mm-hmm.
That way it always is the place that holds the information for the periodic table, nothing else. If it's stuff that's going to be, memorized and then recalled later and then you don't need it ever again, stuff like that, what I do is I have a bunch of memory palaces that I cycle through. And by the time I've, used up all of my memory palaces and cycle back to the first one, most of what I put there, a few days ago or whatever is forgotten, right? And I can reuse it without having any clash or ghosts of what I memorized before. And so that's a good way to kind of keep those memory palaces fresh, is to have a kind of an arsenal of them, not just one or two, but maybe, 5 or 6. It really depends. You can make as many as you like and then just keep them constantly on rotation.
Mm. Now, apart from the memory palace, you mentioned basically every other technique, that probably not every technique known to man, but many of these memory techniques, they go back thousands of years. And in many ways, our current society just forgot about them. And also some ways I was a little overwhelmed by all the various types of techniques that we could use. And I'm curious if there is, say, maybe the top 2, top 3 or 4 types of techniques that you think everybody should know, and that would cover the vast majority of 90% of what we would need to remember in our daily lives. What would you say those are, that we should all have those techniques?
Yeah, I mean, look, I tried my best, because it can get a bit in the weeds, I guess, in terms of strategies for specific things, but I really try to keep it simple with that C-Link Go idea, because that is honestly where it all starts from. And if you just remember that 3-step process, you can literally remember anything. Obviously, there's things that are going to be harder to see than others, and you have to have some kind of helping hand to maybe have an idea of how to go about it. And that's really what the rest of my book is about, is different suggestions for how to encode this or to encode that, and different ways to link this and to link that. But even if you don't know what those are, just going off of C-Link Go should be enough if you don't want to get too overwhelmed. But if we're going to dive deeper into some specifics here, I think the most powerful thing to know is the memory palace technique.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe after that, the linking system, which is helpful for things that are kind of like definition style, where you have one thing that means something else and you're trying to remember their kind of connection there.
Mm. And you also mentioned this in the book at the end of it, that you can use these techniques to help you to learn a foreign language. Wondering if you could tell me more about that.
Yeah, so obviously learning a language is a big task for anybody, but part of the process, you have to memorize things, right? That's inevitable. And if you can remember definitions of words, what they mean, and even grammar rules, then you're going to be able to get to some kind of speaking fluency quicker. That still doesn't replace practicing the language, hearing it a lot, writing it, and being amidst the culture to really understand the language and the people. But if you can get a head start on memorizing, let's say, the first 1,000 most popular or frequently used words in a language, you're way ahead of the game, right? And imagine you could do that in a couple of days, right? In just a few sittings. That's incredible, right? Most people struggle with learning a handful of words over years. You know, they take French or Spanish in high school and they've taken 4 years of it. And by the end of high school, they can't even have a conversation, right? Mm-hmm. So I just talk about a few kind of quick tips to encode some of these kind of definitions and foreign words really quick. There's a great book out there that dives way deeper into it called Fluent Forever by Gabriel Weiner, who employs or writes a lot about some of these memory techniques and language learning process. It's a great book.
And that book will be in the show notes, of course. And one of the examples you give is shou, S-H-O-U, a French word that means cabbage. I'm not sure if I'm saying it correctly, but you imagine yourself taking a shoe and stepping on the cabbage.
That's it. Yeah. And suddenly you have, when an American English speaker hears the word shoe, which is how you pronounce it in French, sounds like shoe. So I'm going to relate what I know, which is some foreign word that sounds like the word shoe that I know, to what it means in the foreign language, which is cabbage. So I think of a shoe. I'm just going to imagine stomping on this cabbage with my shoe, and the sound it would make, the mess it would make, maybe it's my dinner and now I suddenly don't have any dinner, like some emotional kind of charged feeling. And there you go. Every time I hear that word shoe, I'm going to think of a shoe and it's slamming on this cabbage. And that's going to remind me that it's cabbage.
Wow. And these are techniques that I think anybody can learn. And it's been proven to me, even in the past week, of memorizing simple things like a restaurant menu, is it's simply about practice and taking these techniques and doing them over and over again. And I don't even think we have to do them with full intent. It can be something that's sitting in traffic and looking at the license plate in front of us. I'm curious, can you tell me what would be a simple technique that we could use to say, remember the license plate that's in front of us in the car?
Yeah, if you're stuck in traffic, a great exercise to just practice your creativity with coming up with pictures is to look at license plate numbers. They're all around you. So just trying to come up with associations for pairs of letters and pairs of numbers and pairs of letter numbers. Yeah, you can just try to come up with pictures as you see them and give your brain a little workout.
Yeah, I was just thinking of, so if I saw like a ZHR, the first thing that comes to my head is a zebra and a hotel and a rabbit. So now I think of a zebra walks into a hotel and the concierge is a rabbit, and then they have a conversation about me, and then I'm wondering why are they talking about me? What are they saying? And it can be ridiculous, obviously, but the faster and the more you practice this technique of creating these visualizations and these links, the faster it's going to be in the long term. The more that you do it, right? Yeah,
exactly. And you want to flex those imaginative muscles to get better at it.
Now, I want to take a step back from the book and all these various techniques, as I'm sure you talk about them all the time, and talk about how you came to be a memory championship. And then you also have the only online World Memory Championship service other than having to go into an actual physical competition. It is that you do it online, right? I'm curious, can you tell me, how did you start in this focus of memorizing and the various techniques, and then go on to start everything you did?
Yeah. So yeah, I started this because of my grandmother. She had Alzheimer's and eventually passed away from it. And that kind of got me really motivated to make sure that the same thing didn't happen to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I discovered memory championships. And I told myself, I'm going to win this thing, or I'm going to really train to try to win this thing. And that's when I kind of got obsessed with memorizing, and I got obsessed with the sensation of what these memory techniques bring, which is makes you feel like you have some kind of superpower.
Mm-hmm. How old were you at the time?
This was about 10 years ago. Well, a little more. 2008, 2009 was kind of the end of my grandmother's life. And that's when I really started thinking about memory.
Was this before or after college?
It was kind of in the middle of grad school. I took a year off and came back to finish it off. So really not during my college days, unfortunately. I wish I had known this stuff during my undergrad years. I would have been able to study a bit better. But yeah, and then after that, after I started winning championships and getting a lot of notoriety for being a good memorizer, a lot of people asked me to help them, train them, speak to their employees, things like that. So it kind of shifted towards being my career. And I've worked on a number of different projects. One of them has been this online championship that you mentioned called Memory League. We ran kind of an international championship for a few years where we developed software where people could actually play each other or challenge each other online with these memory games. And yeah, we're just trying to spread the word. I'm trying to spread the word about memory techniques and get people hyped up about training their brains.
And so you touched on Alzheimer's. In my book, actually, if any of you have ever read my book, there's a guy named Wilkie who was sort of like my grandfather in a way, and he ended up suffering from Alzheimer's as well. And I started to see his deterioration as he started to go along. It was very like a gradual decline in his ability to remember stuff. And it was definitely disheartening, where I even thought to myself, I would like to have in my will that if I ever can't remember the people around me, that I would want to have assisted suicide at that point. But you can't even make that decision because you keep on forgetting everything. And I just thought how terrible it would be to be in kind of trapped in something like that.
Yeah, it's kind of a nightmare. And that was kind of the motivating factor when I saw my grandmother in that situation. I just thought like how horrible it is for her and for all of us around her, loved ones, you know. There was a documentary I watched a few years ago about a guy who was getting older and realizing that he had early onset Alzheimer's disease and it was going to get very bad in a number of years. And he explored the choice to make kind of that assisted suicide. And it was a weird documentary, made me very uncomfortable, but at the same time, it made a lot of sense. You know, you're a shell of yourself at that point. What's the point, you know, of being there?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, you've also climbed Mount Everest a few times now in order to raise awareness for Alzheimer's. Can you tell me about that?
Yep. I've actually, I haven't summited yet. I've come very, very close each of the times, excruciatingly close to the summit, but I've had to turn around for one reason or another. And I'm hoping to actually go back next spring for my fourth attempt. But, you know, the bigger thing is I try to do it to raise awareness for, again, Alzheimer's disease and to raise some funds for research. And it's always been about kind of the journey, the memorable journey of those trips and trying to keep my life as exciting and memorable as possible while I still have all my faculties, you know?
That reminds me of, there was the recent release of Free Climb, or I believe it was Solo.
Free Solo, yeah.
pretty solo. And then there was another documentary on Netflix a few years ago where I believe, I'm not sure if it was about there was one about Mount Everest, but my memory is not doing too great because I didn't make the C-Link Go association. And I'm curious, when you've been up there these 3 times, was it a personal decision to not proceed? Was it the guides around you? What was the situation around that? Because I know many people have died because it's sort of, you have that sunk cost fallacy where it's like you've made it this far and it's just like, why not? The extra 10% and I'll make the journey. How did you deal with not making the summit?
Yeah, I mean, those decisions were purely mine. I had people to help kind of have me discuss those decisions with, but ultimately it was my decision. At that high altitude, nobody can tell you really what you're feeling or what's right. It's up to you. And they have their own issues to work with. It's really hard to worry about someone else at that point because every ounce of your will and body is going into surviving for yourself. So turning around sucks. It's very, very difficult, especially being so close after all, the money and time that you put into preparing and getting to that point. And then you just gotta, in a sense, give up. But, I just gotta remind myself that I'm not here to kill myself on one of these mountains. I'm just here to experience a journey, find something out about myself and climb for the cause. And, each time I turn around, I ask myself that question: have I done what I wanted to do in the grand scheme of things? And the answer was always yes. So it also helps that these mountains aren't going anywhere. So I can always come back,
And so you've done that in an attempt to raise awareness for World Alzheimer's Day. And so obviously we hope to prevent more people from getting Alzheimer's. I know that there's drugs and science that are helping to eliminate that in the future. And lastly, in the book, you talk about brain health and the fact that it comes down to 4 basic things about diet, physical training, social interaction, and brain training as a way of keeping your brain healthy. I'm curious if you can talk about that as a way of preventing us from getting Alzheimer's.
Yeah. So, I want people to have kind of a little bit of a game plan on how to keep their brain healthy. It's a shame that kind of stuff is not instilled in us from an early age, because for physical health, we know what to do. You got to eat right, and roughly the kinds of foods that are recommended to stay healthy. And so you can follow that. You also know you should be active and doing certain types of exercises to keep your weight reasonable and your heart healthy. But nobody ever tells you anything about your brain and how to keep that thing healthy, which is unfortunate because that's probably more important than your body, since your mind is running the body, right? So I've come up with kind of 4 pillars, as you mentioned. One is eating right. There's certain foods you can eat to kind of feed your brain. Physical fitness. So your brain is always having blood pumped to it to function. So if you can have a healthy body through physical exercise, you're going to have a healthy brain as well that works and is primed very well. Also social interaction. So try and keep your mind active and entertained and busy by being with other people who also are trying to stimulate their own minds. You're going to inherently enhance your experience as well too. And then finally is the actual brain exercise, which is doing some type of memory training or puzzle solving or learning a new skill. I like to, in short, I think the best thing to view it as is if you find yourself in a situation where it's uncomfortable, like it's something difficult for you or it's not comfortable, then that's probably doing really good things for your brain. So, the feeling when you try to learn something new and you just suck at it or it's really hard, that is doing wonders for your brain. So you should keep doing things like that.
Yeah, I'm curious on the brain training aspect. There was a lot of controversy a few years ago over these brain training games like Lumosity, if I'm saying that correctly.
Okay.
Do you think that they're helpful, or do you think just the science just doesn't support that it's worth paying for something like that?
No, I'm a big supporter of Lumosity and things like that. I think there's always some people trying to go after people who make claims, and I'm sure somewhere, even what I'm saying about memory training, someone's going to pick at and say it's bad for this reason. But listen, I'm a perfect example of this, and you can't argue that my memory is better because I've trained these techniques. You can't deny that. And I don't think that I'm going to lose that when I get older. I'm still going to know how to memorize better than anyone or a lot of people. And that's going to carry me further, I think, as I get older. And I think that's the same with any kind of cognitive training that you do. It's going to translate somewhere in a positive way. Sure, I'm super skilled at memorizing playing cards. It's one thing that I train multiple times a day. And then you could say, okay, well, how is that going to help you? You're really good at memorizing cards. Great. But the actual process that goes into that is super applicable to many other things that I may have to memorize every day. And so it's the same argument as like when you go to the gym and you work out specific muscles. Like, when are you ever going to do like a single bicep curl, on a machine like that? Never. But there are tons of movements you're going to do, whether you're trying to avoid a car that nearly hits you or you fall to the ground, and you got to get back up, where you are going to need that bicep muscle, right? And so working out these different facets of cognitive strength and flexibility rounds out for your everyday life, and I think all of them kind of help with that.
So at the end of the day, it's a matter of exercising your brain just as much as you exercise your physical health, whether that's through apps like Lumosity or other methods, whether it's like learning a deck of playing cards.
Exactly. Yep.
On a side note, do you know if Lumosity or if there's any other online game type service that helps to teach you these various memory techniques?
Yeah, so Lumosity is good. I know they're working on more kind of tip-oriented strategies and stuff rather than just the games. The Memory League, the software that I was talking about, they have some tips as well through kind of their online platform aside from the games. And then I'm always trying to make new videos where I can share kind of these tips, and because a lot of the practice, honestly, you can do in daily life, right? You meet people all the time. You have things to memorize every day. So if you just know some of the techniques, you can actually just practice it with your actual day-to-day stuff,
Mm-hmm.
So.
And that's memoryleague.com, by the way. Okay. And I just want to touch back on all the 4 pillars. Like, when it comes to diet, do you have any particular diet that you like to stick to?
I play around with a bunch of different kinds. I'm really in kind of a cycle of being on keto, the keto diet, which for me has done wonders for my mental clarity. I don't know if that's going to be the only thing I would recommend. I don't know if it's for everybody, but I think in general, I can say something like no sugars, low carb diets, no processed foods, that kind of thing is really where your brain begins to shine.
Yeah, I've been practicing paleo for a long time and I feel better consistently. And then I've been adding intermittent fasting of the 16-8, where I 16-8. Eat with an 8-hour window from like 12 to 8 o'clock, and then I'll fast beyond that.
Yeah, I've been mixing that in too, and that really, it's worked wonders too.
Yeah. But then on that note, of course, everybody has a different body. And I think there's been emerging science and beliefs of this whole paleo keto movement. But then also you look at I believe it's called the blue group zone, or the blue zone, where they've done studies all around the world looking at what helps people live the longest. And you look in Asian cultures, is that they eat tons and tons of rice and noodles, which is a lot of carbs. And so we're demonizing carbs, but there's also, they've shown genetically that some people are predispositioned to processing fat versus carbs better. And so it's all about what works for you. And I think that's going to be different for everyone. So keep that in mind.
Exactly.
And then lastly, on the physical training, is there any technique, any routine that you regularly incorporate?
I mean, for me, yes, my routine is I go to the gym practically every day. Maybe I take a day off each week, but my thing is CrossFit.
Yeah. I've actually been doing CrossFit for the past few weeks and I absolutely love it.
Nice. Yeah. I've been doing it since 2012. And for me, I love that it was always changing. It's never the same thing. I always find new things to become sore from. And that always tells me that I'm moving the needle in terms of my strength and endurance. And yeah, I love the competitive side of it. That really works for me in terms of pushing myself. So that's the way I get my activity in.
And so on a daily routine basis, what does your typical day look like?
Yep. So I wake up very early, a little bit before 6, and do a bit of work. And then I go to the gym, train for about an hour and a half. come back, dive into my memory training. So each day I'll do about, it depends on whether a competition's coming up or not, but let's say there isn't, I'll train my brain about 2 hours a day. When there's a competition that is coming soon, I will ramp up to about 3 to 5 hours a day. And so I train kind of the specific events that happen at these competitions, memorizing names, memorizing cards, memorizing numbers, words, dates, things like that. And I kind of work for an hour, take a little break, come back, work for another hour, take a little break. It's important for me, especially since I'm always using my mind, to kind of do short-ish sessions. If not, I just get burnt out,
Right. Yeah, I think there's science that shows that we have the Pomodoro, which is based on 25-minute sessions, and there's science about 50 minutes, and it all just depends on the person about what your routine looks like, because you're going to get tired throughout the day. But being able to recognize when you're at your troughs versus your peaks is an important fact.
Yeah, and there's even I think the scientist's name was Zagurnik, but the Zagurnik effect is that if you are working on something, let's say you're writing a paper or a speech or just working on a project, if you take a break from it and come back to it a little bit later, it's going to be more memorable to you because of that break, actually. So some people think that they need to study something for 2-3 hours straight, but you actually would be doing better if you took short breaks in between in terms of wanting it to stick kind of more naturally. You don't have to do any memory techniques there. It's almost like an inherent thing that will happen if you break it up.
Right. And even if you try and learn or read something before bed, there's science that shows that we're more likely to remember it if we remember it and then go to sleep right after.
Yeah, I've heard that too. Yeah.
Now, when it comes to supplements, I know supplements, it accounts really for maybe like 5 or 10%, or probably even less than 10% of your overall output or your ability to memorize certain things. And it really definitely comes down to those 4 basic pillars that we mentioned earlier. Yeah. I'm curious, are there any supplements, and if you have any thoughts on them? One in particular I thought of that even Tim Ferriss has mentioned taking is called Hyperzine A. And I'm curious if you've heard of that, and if you have any thoughts on other supplements that has been shown to help improve memory.
I have not heard of that one, to be honest. And I don't know. I've heard of things over the years that might help your memory. Things like the kind of supplements I take are like DHA omega-3, which are kind of more dietary. Mm-hmm. But I'm too scared to try any of these other kind of things just because I really like what I'm doing with my own memory, and I don't want to mess it up.
Right.
I could be missing out on stuff. I don't know, but I haven't explored too much with that.
Yeah. Don't break what's not broken. Methodology.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think we're reaching the end, and I want to just ask perhaps 1 or 2 more questions. And I'm curious, what is your North Star? I know it's a big question. What are you hoping to achieve over your lifetime? Or is there any goal, or what is your why, as Simon Sinek always refers to?
My why, my reason is I want people to know about what I'm doing for their own sake. I could care less if they're impressed with me or not. I want people to know that I was an everyday kind of guy, average memory, and here I am talking to you guys as a memory champion. And anybody out there could be a memory champion. We all have the capability to do what I can do with my memory. And so my purpose is to teach as many people as possible in the world before I die how to do this and to make this stuff as common knowledge as possible, because ultimately I think it's going to help with the future of Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is scarily, even more and more by the day, looking like there's no positive kind of research or results that look like it's going to help anytime soon. And that's really scary. And so the best thing next after that, aside from potentially developing some kind of drug to help with it, is some type of memory therapy, which is what I teach in a way. And if people know that, then that's going to be at least something towards improving our situation in this country for Alzheimer's.
So Nelson, where can they go to learn these techniques that you're teaching?
Yeah, so best thing I would recommend, maybe start at my website, nelsondellis.com. I have a bunch of links there. You can follow through my blog or link to my YouTube channel, or go directly to my YouTube channel. I have a bunch of videos on memory techniques. Books, of course. I'm, of course, going to recommend my book as a starting point, Remember It. That's the name of the book. Also, Moonwalking with Einstein, like we said, is also a good book. It's a little more general, but it's a great, fun read about memory and its history. What else? And then some of these training sites, Lumosity, I highly recommend. Memory League, play on there. There's another one called Memo Camp, which also has some good memory games. Yeah.
Wow, fantastic. I think we'll end on that. Thank you again for being with us here today, Nelson. It's been a blast to have you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me as well.
Thank you. I'll see you soon.
Yeah, take care.
Hey guys, this is Cody again. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Mind Hack, and if you're interested in getting more Mind Hack-worthy stuff straight to your inbox, then you might consider signing up for my weekly newsletter. It often contains links to new episodes, blog posts, and other interesting finds I found on the interweb in the past week. It pretty much focuses around productivity and efficiency. So if that's your thing, then be sure to visit my website at codymclean.com. That's MCLAIN.com to sign up. Also, if there are any interesting websites, companies, books, blog posts, quotes, or anything else that was mentioned in this episode, you can find it all and more by visiting the official website for the Mind Hack Show at mindhack.com. And as always, if you have any feedback, good or bad, I want to hear it. Send me a tweet, email, or what have you on either of my websites, as my goal with this show is to give you the maximum value in the shortest amount of time. That's all for now, guys. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you guys again soon.